Matt Stoller is so many things. It's very hard to list. I'm going to have to be very selective. Otherwise, we're going to spend 45 minutes talking about who Matt is. To begin with, he is with the Economic Liberties Institute. He is also the author of the Substack Big, which, as its name suggests, it focuses on antitrust violations and the way in which particularly big tech, but other corporations as well, become so big that they're unmanageable. And he's the author of what I consider to be certainly one of the definitive histories, if not the definitive history, on the history of antitrust and democracy, and particularly how it focuses on big tech. The name of that book is Goliath, the 100-Year War between monopoly power and democracy. He's also a friend of the show and a friend of some of us here, including me. Matt, it is great to see you tonight. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on. We appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we have a lot to talk about, so why don't we just dive right in. There's a lot going on, obviously, since Trump's victory, and a lot of these appointments are generating some really interesting analysis and big question marks, given how they're not exactly a model of cogency, which is what one would expect from Donald Trump. Before we get into all of that, though, there's a lot of debate. Every time there's a new nominee chosen to head a department, to be a cabinet secretary, there's all this digging and understanding, oh, what does this mean? Oh, look, this person's this, that means the administration is going to be this. Or, oh, this person's the opposite, that means the administration will be that. Given just Donald Trump in general, but also how Washington works, how reliable of an indicator do you think these nominations are when it comes to the question of what Donald Trump, sitting in the Oval Office, is going to decide and what his administration will be?
I mean, I think that they are an indication of the options that he's giving himself. So he has certain instincts, but you need people who know the levers of government to pull, who know how to write executive orders or where the authorities are, or how to convince Congress to do things. And where he had people in positions to do that, he could do a lot, and where he didn't, he would often be undermined, even if he wanted to go ahead and actually do a lot of stuff. So one example would be when he rewrote NAFTA, right? So the trade agreement between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, it was a very unpopular agreement. He said, I want to rewrite it. And he hired someone named Robert Lighthizer to be the head of the U.S. Trade Representative, which is the part of government that manages trade, or a lot of trade. And Lighthizer is a very well-respected trade lawyer and agreed with Donald Trump's instincts. And so because of that, he was able to do a lot with tariffs, and he was able to do a lot in terms of renegotiating NAFTA. And he was actually able to bring a bunch of Democratic votes to do that. So that was an area where he was able to really restructure policy because he had someone who agreed with him and knew what he was doing. I think there are other areas where that wasn't necessarily the case. There was more kind of sort of, I guess, swampy people that subverted what he wanted to do, or maybe, gave him different options than what he ordinarily would have chosen. So it's not to say that he always did the things that trade people or hawks wanted to do. It's just to say that if he wanted to go in that direction, he could. So that's how I look at these guys.
Yeah, but I don't think that's the normal way that administrations are typically constructed, especially when it comes to cabinet secretaries. You have a Democratic president. They usually come out of the Democratic Party kind of machine that produces these sorts of people, or from within the agencies. Same with Republican administrations. Typically, you can identify exactly who those kind of people are going to be. I think there were a lot of those people inside the first Trump administration, and maybe that's the lesson that he learned. But I was talking to Li Fong late last week about RFK's appointment and all the animosity it's provoking. And it's really ironic because RFK's principal focus is the critique that our agencies in general, but our healthcare agencies and regulatory system in particular, have been co-opted by industry. They don't regulate industry. Industry controls them through the revolving door and donors and all these other weapons that Washington has developed, which is a long-standing left-wing critique, and yet we've never really had a HHS secretary who has gone in not as an ancillary critique, but as a crusade for a long time and said, I want to end this regulatory capture by big pharma, by big food, by the health insurance companies. And I was asking Lee about this, like, it's so interesting that this is what the left has long wanted on the one hand, and now they get it in the form of Trump and RFK. But on the other, the American right was indignant when Michelle Obama was just sort of using her platform to encourage people to exercise more and eat better food in schools. And the argument was, how dare this nanny state, who is she to tell our kids what to eat? And now you see this immense support, not for everything RFK stands for, but certainly for this. And Lee said, well, this is one of the ways in which, in so many instances, Trump has kind of thrown a wrench into what had been these long-standing ossified left versus right categories. Is that something that you think is a valid, I don't think it's even a praise or critique, it's just kind of an analysis.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's hard to, I don't know what to make of RFK Jr., but I think he's certainly not, your standard pick for anything. I mean, I'm definitely more of a, there's a lot there that I'm intrigued by and skeptical of. But one of the things that he said, right? I mean, I was not a huge fan of his, but one of the things that he said is he wants to re-examine. There's this process by which I think Medicare and certain government benefits.
I think it's Medicaid. I think it's Medicaid. You mean like their billing process?
Yeah. I mean, the way that the American Medical Association essentially sets rates and sets ways that doctors can bill for different procedures. And it is very much a cartel, and it is government sort of sanctioned. And Democrats have been, not all, but some Democrats have been fairly unhappy with it for quite some time because it's costly and often excludes people who can deliver care from doing it. And RFK said he would, he's looking at redoing those billing codes. And I thought, that seems like a pretty good idea. The American Medical Association doesn't actually have a lot of members, and it is weird that they have control over important aspects of medical billing, considering that healthcare is, it's 20% of the economy, and we spend twice as much here as we do anywhere else, as anyone else does in the world, and we get worse outcomes, and it's just more expensive. So I thought that was really interesting, and I'm kind of curious to see where else he goes in terms of addressing, the regulatory problems and the market power problems, and so I'm intrigued.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say in RFK Jr.'s case that it's not like he just started talking about this 3 months ago in order to get this job. This has been a crusade of his for years, these kinds of critiques of how the executive branch and the regulatory industry function. And I think the question is going to be, how far will he be able to go? How far will other officials in the administration be able to go? Like, who will limit them? When will they get their way? And that's why I think there's this kind of overemphasis on evaluating every choice.
Yeah, I mean, there are reasons for skepticism as well, right? I mean, I'm sort of a Democratic normie, right? So I accept a lot of what the news tells me. So maybe stuff isn't true, but what I hear, I'm nervous about some of the anti-vax stuff. Like, I'm glad we got rid of polio, and I think fluoride in water is good, right? But I don't know how much power he's going to have at HHS to change that. So I'm skeptical of the part of the dynamic here is when you bring in people who are anti-establishment, they have very different views. And there's a kind of question. So I'm sort of more in the establishment than not. And there's a kind of question of, all right, well, if you're going to let that in, they're going to do things that you may not agree with that seem outlandish, but they're also going to maybe attack problems that no one else is willing to attack either. And so I guess my hope, and it is a hope, I don't know, but I was pleased to see what he said about the American Medical Association, the billing codes. But my hope is that he attacks those problems that everybody's been too afraid to deal with.
Well, I mean, he's, as I said, been talking about them, and not in an ancillary way, but very vocally and frontally, and he continues to do so. And I think, we've seen presidents get elected swearing that they're going to implement policies, and they're not able to do so because various parts of the systems prevent that. So whatever, the worst view of the nominee is or the secretary is, doesn't mean that that's actually going to happen, because we've seen with presidents so often how many different ways there are to impede them. All right, let me ask you, because it's so interesting.
I also say one other thing about RFK, which whatever you think, I do feel like you have some special credibility to object to the establishment if they're still keeping records secret about who assassinated your uncle, right? So I do think there's like some fair, like if someone has a reason to be like bitter and distrustful of the government, that guy does. Like, that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all kind of should be wondering, hey, these files are 62 years
records,
old.
by the way.
But yeah, if it's like your actual uncle and then your father was killed 3 years later, also under not as mysterious circumstances, but still with a little confusion, I can definitely understand. Although his whole life was spent in the Democratic Party, I think what really radicalized him was a lot of the COVID stuff, a lot of the orthodoxies that were imposed, the censorship that went along with it, much of which turned out to be true.
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing about RFK is I think, you can say what you want about him. I've interviewed him. I've talked to him. I mean, he is a true believer. He's not saying things to manipulate political opinion or to advance his own political career that he doesn't actually believe, which I always think is an asset. All right, let me move on a little bit, because one of the things I find so interesting is, we've had this flurry of appointees, like to the cabinet, secretaries, to leading various agencies, now to undersecretaries, and there's all this analysis being conducted about what it means. Several months ago, 4 or 5 months ago, Trump made a pretty significant choice, which was the person who was going to be his running mate. And there were a lot of names on that list that the establishment eagerly wanted him to choose, including Marco Rubio, who is now the Secretary of State. And everybody's thrilled with that, from every Democrat to every person deep in the bowels of Langley. But he chose JD Vance instead, who definitely has some heterodox ideas, both on foreign policy, but especially domestic policy. Obviously, it's a question of how much influence and power he'll wield, which I guess you can't really speculate any better than anybody else. But in terms of some of those views, like why the Wall Street Journal editorial page was so indignant when Trump chose JD Vance, tell us a little bit about, in your areas and related ones, why he was received so poorly by those establishment factions.
Yeah, so Vance he's a really interesting figure, because he's somebody who was your kind of standard libertarian corporate establishment guy, and a true believer, not somebody who just thought this was a good way to get ahead. And then he served in the military, in war, and he went to a fancy law school after growing up. I think people know his background. But he said he realized in Silicon Valley, when he was a venture capitalist, that companies that seemed to be on the surface doing very well were uninvestable. And that is because Google was going to kill them. That's what he talked about. He's like, it's just really weird that these certain companies that seemed to be doing well just couldn't succeed, because everybody knew, the monopolist in the industry is one day just going to crush them. And he said over time, he realized that America had a problem where we're not making things that we need to make. And the traditional corporate establishment solutions of more, tax cuts for corporations and deregulation, they're not necessarily always bad, but they were sort of besides the point. And I think he went on a kind of journey where he started to look at things like questions of market power and industrial policy and tariffs. And, he talks about it, like people say, oh, he flip-flopped because in 2016 he didn't like Trump, and then he decided he did like Trump, and it's just careerism. And I actually saw the development of his economic thinking at the same time. So I think there was just a sincere way that he changed his mind. And so when he became a senator, and he became a senator with Donald Trump's help and endorsement, he got in there and he said, we need to break up big tech with antitrust, and we need to actually regulate railroads for safety purposes. So that was the East Palestine disaster that was in his state. He talked about cracking down on Wall Street banker bonuses when their banks fail, like the Silicon Valley Bank fiasco. And there were just kind of like a host of areas where he broke from the traditional conservative orthodoxy. And I think like Josh Hawley, he has a kind of Teddy Roosevelt vibe, might be the way to put it, like that kind of thinking. And it's conservative, it's right wing, but it's not, what you would consider just sort of corporatist. And I think that was really shocking and upsetting to a lot of the traditional Republican establishment when Trump picked him.
Yeah, and of course, like Lena Khan has been one of the most controversial picks of the Biden administration to lead the FTC. She's justified that controversy by taking a lot of aggressive action to break up monopolies. And you have these Democratic Party donors and the kind of managerial class that is in charge of the Democratic Party, as well as a lot of Republican sort of just standard business people from like the Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, Reagan-esque tradition that can't stand her, that thinks she's the root of all evil, that want her gone as soon as possible. The Wall Street Journal page in particular hates her. And yet, like Josh Hawley, JD Vance has made a lot of very vocal and public statements in support of Lena Khan, as has Matt Gaetz. Do you think this wing of the Republican Party still is kind of fringe and marginalized? Or given the fact that one of them is now the vice president, do you hold hope that in this administration they'll be able to maneuver more freely and gain more power?
They're not marginalized. They certainly matter. I mean, JD Vance is vice president, and they have, there are some senators that and members that believe in what they're doing. They're also, the Attorney General of Tennessee, very conservative Republican. He's bringing antitrust lawsuits. The Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, he's got suits against seed and chemical monopolists and Google. He's got some privacy stuff, and so it's not marginal. But I would say that those same people that really dislike Lena Khan's the same people that really didn't want JD Vance to be chosen. And they're very powerful. And they have a lot of allies. I think the Trump administration just chose a director for his National Economic Council. His name is, I think, Kevin Hazlitt. And I suspect he's somebody who really is hostile to the anti-monopoly agenda. And I think you'll see a number of people, particularly in the Commerce Department, in the Treasury Department, kind of across, it's possible Pam Bondi who's going to be the Attorney General. You might see a substantial amount of hostility to the anti-monopoly agenda, even though there are parts of the Trump administration that do want to address market power by big companies and big tech.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.